Good evening and welcome to the Thursday, January 27th, 2022 School Board Work Session. The time is now 6 p.m. The school board would like to take this moment to respectfully acknowledge we are residing on the traditional land of the Dene people. Our mission statement is to provide an excellent, equitable education in a safe, supportive environment so all students will succeed and contribute to a diverse and changing society. Mrs. Tuttle, can we please get a roll call?
Mr. Sampson?
Here.
Thank you. Mrs. Matheson is excused. Mr. Doran?
Here.
Thank you. Mrs. Sanderson by Zoom?
Here.
Thank you. Ms. Marati by Zoom?
Here.
Thank you. Mrs. Smith?
Here.
Thank you. Mrs. Luke?
Here.
Thank you. The board has a quorum.
Thank you. We will move right into our agenda item, continued facility utilization, considerations and work, core value. Center everything we do on the student and student learning. The school board will continue its discussion, consideration, and work on the proposed facility utilization proposals. I will turn the time over to administration to Mrs. Moline, and we'll get started.
Thank you, President Luke. And as you can see, some of us are attending via Zoom, and some are there in the room. So we'll be in both spaces answering questions. And I thought what we would do is move forward with like we did last time, go through the questions that we've received over the last few days and weeks, and then answer them, giving time for clarification as we go. So we'll just start down through our questions, and then as we get into it, different folks both online and in the room will answer the questions. So the first one is both Anderson and Joy staff have expressed fear and frustration due to not having a plan, an estimated course. Could the district administration transparently discuss this at the meeting tonight? So we've been kind of threading this needle of making no assumptions respecting the board and making no assumptions as to the direction they'll go, while at the same time working on a framework. So we've discussed at some length the approach that might be taken, giving the possible directions the board could go. We had preliminary meetings. We have had a number of preliminary meetings with the three principals of the buildings being considered for closures, talked next steps or first steps that might be involved. We've talked about extensively with the executive director team, as well as the principals, the steps around moving equipment. We've explored possibilities of schedules to give teachers and staff time to prepare for the move. The timelines, we've looked at that for staff changes. There have been many conversations about Title I students, about equipment that's been identified and purchased with Title I funding. We've talked at great length, and I think later on, Executive Director Coyle will go into more details, but there's been extensive talks about program impacts for SPED, possible changes. We've talked about transportation impacts. We've discussed briefly the borough transfer, just at a high level, because we don't have anything further to talk about except that this is happening. I've just wanted to be really respectful for the board, and I don't want to make any assumptions and start talking very detailed about directions until the board has had a chance to work through this and make their decisions. So while we're building a framework, I do want to be respectful to the board and their process. So the next question was, where do the figures of 18 million for Joy's roof maintenance come from? Could the board be provided copies of the RFP? So for this question, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. DeGraw to dive into this.
Thank you, Ms. Moline. So the $18 million figure never specifically referred to solely a roof for Joy Elementary School. So the $18 million was a CIP number that was generated to itemize long-term capital needs for that building. And I want to update the board. So there's been some confusion. Well, 23, and this leads into the next question, $23 million for Ann Ween and $18 million for Joy. So why would Ann Ween not be the school that the administration identified? So we're currently working on updated numbers from the 23 million and the $18 million. So current, and this is going off of the CIP list that the board approved back in May or June of last year. So current CIP anticipated needs over the next 20 years are Ann Ween approximately 18,200,000 and Joy 21.9 million. And specifically, you hear a lot of talk about Joy and its roof, and there are problems. The reason for the difference in the old figures that were included in the school efficiency report and the CIP numbers that we have in our current report that the board approved is a roof issue. The roof is leaking at Joy. There was a replacement, and this also creates some confusion. Is folks recall a recent roof update to Joy? Well, they only updated the flat portion of the building. The last work that was done on the circular portion of the building was prior to that, many years prior, and it was only basically a patch work job of a few $100,000, nowhere near what it would cost to really do a major renovation on that size of a roof and the unique nature of it, right? Not a flat roof, but a round roof. So current numbers that we're working off of, again, are a little over 18 million for Ann Ween as far as CIP needs are concerned, and just shy of $22 million for Joy. It's important to point out also that that's not the only factor that worked into our decision. Really, the bigger issue is the age of the building and the current maintenance needs of the building. So how much effort does it take our FMD staff to maintain the buildings in relation to each other? And I just want to turn the time over to Ms. Carrion to provide some additional details to that.
So just to kind of add to that, Joy is approximately 30 plus years older than Ann Ween. It was originally built in 1961, and I think the additional portion was in 1989. And so that was the roof that Mr. DeGraw was referring to. That was, there was a project on that roof. So the round roof, the circular roof that you see, that was rehabbed back in 2007. So it really is in need of a capital improvement project, which was not, it's listed in there in the 20-year, but it's listed more further out. But it actually we need to look at it and bring it a little bit sooner because of the needs that Joy's roof is leaking right now. So another factor is some of the components to the building is no longer available. So it's really difficult to find parts for Joy, being that it's a really older building. And then that's one of the main factors why we looked at Joy, was because of parts are outdated. We can't find them. I've got one person, if I'm just looking at the HVAC control system, that's just one factor of a bigger factor. He's trying to find parts but can't. So he's trying to find parts from other places, other schools, to try and repair that. So that was one of the main reasons why Joy was considered instead of Ann Ween.
So, Ms. Carroll, yes.
We have a question from the board.
Just real quick, Mr. DeGraw, you mentioned we'll get an updated CIP list. Is that for Tuesday's meeting?
Or are you asking, can we provide you guys a copy of the current one?
I thought you had said in your opening comments or near there, that you had done an update on the CIPs, so.
Yeah, referring to the current one that the board approved in May, update relative to the school efficiency report figures.
Right, which was 2
Yeah,
years,
correct.
which he had not updated.
Correct.
Right, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mrs. Moline. I apologize.
No, that's fine. I'll work on my wait time in between questions. I did want, there was a portion of that question concerning an RFP. Ms. Carrion, would you like to speak to that, or Mr. DeGraw?
Yeah, I think the confusion might have been that the thought was that there was an $18 million roof project specifically in the works, and that has never been the case. It was a reference to long-term capital needs, and the roof being a major portion of those long-term capital needs, but there's no project in existence currently with an RFP attached to it.
Okay, our next question is also concerning maintenance. The maintenance being discussed is outside of this person's know-how, and would like for Ms. Carrion to provide an expertise on the perspective of the needs of the building. So Ms. Carrion, if you want to address that question.
Okay, so the way I understood this was specifically in comparison to Anne Ween and Joy. And so in the capital improvement projects, you'll see that there are similar needs for Anne Ween and Joy in terms of what is needed for the future renovation projects. And so for Anne Ween, there's the renovation phase 2, which is upgrading the new roof for a new roof, roof drains, the EFIS, windows, the exterior doors, and the exterior lighting. There's also upgrades needed for classrooms, which includes all the replacement of the casework, cabinetry, the shelving, student books, etc. And then there's also a renovation for mechanical upgrades, which includes the plumbing, the electrical service, and all the interior upgrades that was not previously done before, and some site improvements as well. And so for Joy, very similar, only the difference is Joy needs those upgrades a lot sooner than Anne Ween. So the classroom upgrades for Joy, we slated for on the CIP project for 2024, and that's next year. So again, Joy needs more immediate upgrades. So even though you'll see that there are similar upgrades between Anne Ween and Joy, Joy does need those upgrades a lot sooner. And again, just kind of talking about Joy, again, I've mentioned earlier, just the maintenance needs of Joy. It's very challenging, just not being able to find parts for Joy. And then the amount of, just looking at the work orders for last year for Joy was a lot higher than Anne Ween as well.
Mr. Sampson?
Thank you. You mentioned looking at the work orders from last year, one was higher than the other. Can you give me the total sum of the two buildings? Speaking in reference to the total of the year.
So for Joy, I believe there was 244, and then Anne Ween was about 212. And those are just rough estimates. I could go back and get you actuals.
So they were about the same.
Well, Joy had a little bit more, and so there's more time. So if you're only looking at the actual number of work orders as opposed to the number of hours that was spent on it, then there's a big difference between Anne Ween and Joy's work orders as well.
Thank you.
So Mrs. Luke, if you will tell me just when we're ready to move on and you feel like everyone's questions are answered, we'll do that.
Thank you. We have one more question, Mr. Doran.
Thank you. I know we're talking mainly, right now we've referenced Joy and Anne Ween. If it's not inappropriate to get a similar thing with Anderson, since that's the other major school. And I know some of the similar factors.
I do have a copy of Anderson renovation capital improvement plans that we have. So Anderson needs a new roof upgrade. They also need new windows, and they do need new exterior doors and exterior lighting. And there was, I think the windows, I don't know if you've been out there, but they're unique, and then we don't have those kind of windows anywhere else in the district. So there's a lot of challenges for the windows out in Allison. They also do need a mechanical upgrade, and that's slated for 2025. And so that's the same thing, plumbing upgrades, new electrical service distribution, and interior upgrades that were not completely completed previously. They also do need classroom upgrades, and that includes all the other things that I've mentioned, including replacement of the casework, cabinetry, shelving, student books, and everything that wasn't that needs upgraded.
Just to finish out that thought, Mr. Dorn, the total of the work that Ms. Carrion just itemized in the next 9 years is approximately $15.5 million.
Ms. Marotti?
Thank you. Can you explain the reasoning behind the upgrades? Are they needed in order to function as a school? And you mentioned that the only difference between Unween and Joy is the difference is that Joy needs the upgrade sooner. Can you explain why that timeline is sooner?
So Joy being an older building, it's the roof lifespan is usually 20 years, and Joy is over 50 years old. So it's on its second phase of the roof upgrade. So that's one of the main reasons why Joy was considered for the school closure instead of Unween, was because age was definitely a major factor in that decision.
And then if you want to go ahead and cover, are these upgrades needed to conduct school? Who decides these upgrades are done? I believe is what Ms. Marotti was one of her questions, but I'll let her clarify.
That's great. Thank you, Ms. Milling. My questions were, why are about the timeline, and then, so why is Joy needed sooner? And can a school function without these upgrades or not?
So as you can see, school is still functioning. It's just very challenging for the maintenance department to be able to make all these things function. So in terms of maintenance hours and finding the replacement, that's one of the main factors in why Joy was considered, was because in order for us to keep school remain open, it is harder for us to find the parts to keep the school open. So yes and no. I mean, we will want to try to not close schools down because of maintenance, but it's very challenging for our maintenance team to have the school continue running with very challenging components to find. Mr. DeGraw?
Yeah, and this is actually a really good question. I'm glad that Ms. Marotti asked this question, and I'm going to get to a high-level strategic narrative right here in that, and I'm going to make kind of a blanket statement. We're starting to dangerously neglect the condition of our buildings district-wide. We've had some conversations with the borough and talking about how we as a district want to get a little more aggressive in getting school projects onto the borough's CIP list. We're running into situations to where we're playing with fire, so to speak, in that we're running from one situation to the next, putting Band-Aids on significant issues, and then running to the next significant issue and putting a Band-Aid on it. Due to long-term getting to where we're neglecting certain situations. We have a boiler situation at North Pole High that is, if one were to see that situation, they would say it wouldn't shock anybody if next week a cold snap hit and the heat went down. So, do the buildings need these upgrades in order to continue to function? My response is an unequivocal yes. And FMDs at apartment, we're in a budget reducing cycle, right? And we want to reduce as far away from the instruction as we can. So unfortunately, the FMD department and our facilities are our usual suspects as far as targets for reductions, and that can turn around and bite us in the long run. It really can. And just case in point, the weather Armageddon over the holiday break. We had a short-staffed crew running from emergency to emergency to emergency to emergency, and they just performed phenomenally. But really, things start to quickly expose, longer-term issues that we've been really, to be honest, been neglecting and really need to start taking a harder look at and addressing, so that we don't see bigger issues as far as instruction interruption for students down the road.
Thank you. I have Mrs. Smith and then Mrs. Sanderson after.
Thank you. I just, I thought I heard in there that you said that Joy was moved to more urgent than it was on the CIP because they currently have a roof leak. And I just didn't want that to be glossed over, that they have a current problem situation that has to immediately be addressed. It's something that's pressing, where it wasn't pressing when the CIP was made, but now is pressing.
That's correct.
Ms. Sanderson?
Yes, Ms. Corione and Mr. DeGraw, it would be fair to say that under Mr. Norm and Mr. Nielsen, they were aware, and we have kind of kicked the can down the road of the maintenance on some of our older buildings, that these were brought to the board's attention. But, change of, 2 directors now, and with the formulation of the CPI with Borough, that we were aware of the age and the difficulties in maintaining some of our older structures. Is that true?
Yeah, I would agree with that. But at the same time, I would say I don't think it's any one person. We can't necessarily point the finger at any one person or entity. I think it's the product of limited resources and a lot of areas of need around us, right, Miss? I agree, Miss Sanderson. It's just hard decisions with limited resources. So I wouldn't necessarily lay the issues at the feet of any one person or entity, but just acknowledging the urgency of certain situations that we're seeing now, and I think it's time that we need to address those situations.
And not laying blame, but just making aware that under both of these directors, they did make us aware of issues.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Absolutely.
The next thing I'll say that with every retirement, we are losing historical knowledge of older buildings and how they were maintained and how we were able to satisfy the maintenance portion on those buildings. Is that not also a true statement?
Absolutely. Yeah, and just would further the need of needing those to see upgrades occur. Sure.
Thank you.
Mr. Sampson?
Thank you, President Luke. Since we're on the subject of old buildings, maybe we can turn our attention to the school that's located just down the street from Nordale, Ladd Elementary. I think it was built in 52 or 53. What was the year Ladd was? Maybe you could go to Ladd Elementary.
So
Fairbanks.
LAD was built in 1992.
Say again? It was rebuilt in
1992
and
was the original building.
And its buddy down the street, Nordale, we tore that down and rebuilt that back in
That was 2016.
16.
I'm sorry, 1996.
Thank you.
I'll have to take a look.
90, it would have been 2001-ish, something of that
Mr.
nature.
Doran might know.
Oh, there you go. 16 years old, so 2005.
That's it, thanks.
Mr. Doran?
Okay, and maybe just help me with the clarification. LAD was a new school. It didn't replace a former building. And Nordale was built in 53, the original building, and then replaced in 2005. I'm sorry. Denali was built in 51. And then Nordale 2 years later. Yeah, I think, but anyway, but you have some information. So.
All right, Mrs. Moline?
Okay, thank you. So the next question that came in to us was, why was there representatives from Anderson and Nordale on the task force, but no one represented from Joy? So when we were forming the task force, we approached each of the unions to give us suggestions of who might be possible candidates to serve on the task force. And so we picked from that list. And then I think it's also important to note that the principal at Joy is an interim principal.
It looks like no, oh, Ms. Marati?
Thank you. Thank you for the answer to that question. Is there a reason why a representative wasn't chosen for Joy? It just seems odd that the representation was there for Anderson and Nordale and not Joy.
It was done strictly by, a list of people that were given to us that, first of all, were willing to serve, and then were suggested to us by unions. We reached out to the Parent Engagement Committee for possible people. At that point, it was a pretty large field, and it wasn't necessarily targeting a group. It was looking at the larger picture. So, it wasn't necessarily an intentional pick of a representative from Nordale and a representative from Anderson. Those two principals were names on the list. They were willing to serve. And then we picked from the other names we were given. And we did contact a number of different people, and they just weren't willing to serve. So that's how the task force was formed.
May I follow up?
Yes.
I appreciate the explanation. However, I hope that in the future that this oversight could be caught before the task force is finalized, and that if two of the three schools that are on most of the options have representation and one doesn't, that is looked at as an issue and solved before the task force is finalized.
No other questions for that.
Okay. Next question. Anderson's staff are requesting time to move their own items to their new school. Will extra contract days be provided to them prior to school start in the fall? So I'll start with this, and then if you have further questions, Ms. McDaniel's on Zoom and she can go into it with more detail. We have discussed a number of different approaches to supporting teachers during this transition and during this process. And that's one of the items in the framework that doesn't have any concrete decisions yet. But there have been a number of different ways that we could approach this.
I can just add, Ms. Moline, that over the next couple of weeks after the board has made their decision, we will be working with union leadership on various topics just of this matter. Just as Ms. Moline said in kind of the onset of the questions, that we don't want to work too far ahead of the board, while we recognize that this is something that is of an interest to our staff, to not just our teachers, but to staff, because not only classroom teachers have belongings and a great deal of items in the school to move. So we'll be working with union leadership in the next couple of weeks after the board votes to help kind of facilitate these conversations and make firm plans for staff to be able to move their belongings and such.
Ms. Marati, did you have a question?
No, Ms. McDaniel, Ilgen Fritz answered it for me. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. All right, Ms. Moline?
So the next question we have is, if the board votes to close Joy, where will the student memorial be moved to? And we have discussed that again on a number of different occasions and have explored a couple of different ideas, but wanted to be respectful to the board and not get out in front of them on any decision making. So that's a part of our framework discussions, but nothing concrete has been decided.
Mr. Doran?
I appreciate that there needs to be time to actually go through those details. But at the same time, in the school capacity projections that we have, if I'm correct, those numbers of students have been distributed in some format, maybe not the final format, or, we need to see exactly where those students live and how many live in each area. And so I know we can't get ahead of that, but they do seem to reflect some distribution of students. Am I correct on that? And how is that approached?
Yeah, so just to clarify, Mr. Doran, you're talking about students from the hypothetical closure of Joy and Nordale, distribution of those students to other elementaries?
Right, and we have two, one in which both schools are included as closed. We're one school.
Yeah, so
Same thing with Anderson's pretty clear because they all go to Crawford.
Correct.
Okay, I think I'm confused here. So let me just jump in and get some clarity. Are we referring to the student memorial at Joy or redistribution of students?
The redistribution of students, I believe, was the question.
Okay.
I'll respond to Mr. Doran's question if that's all right.
Yes.
Okay. So under the 6-8 scenario where we close both Joy and Nordale in the proposed scenario, the students are evenly distributed to the neighboring schools. And yes, you're exactly correct in that final decisions on boundaries would be made after administration puts forward a hypothetical reboundary of the district, and it went through that board process. But it's basically a linear distribution of students to neighboring schools.
Okay, that's helpful, and thank you, because I think also for the public looking at those numbers would say, well, wait a minute, you have something, but no, it's not really.
Sure. Yeah, we expect.
But it's a way to accommodate for all those seats, for the number of seats. Okay.
For the purpose of projections, we have what we have now. We would expect some alteration from those projections to reality once the reboundary is set.
Okay. And can I just interject a note? Really appreciated. I met at length with Mr. DeGraw on a number of numbers, and I really appreciated that. He gave me some good information and things to think about and made sure I was in line with an understanding of those. So I really appreciated that time.
Mrs. Moline?
Okay. Another question that came in, if the board votes to close Anderson, could Crawford be renamed Anderson Crawford Elementary? So that's a process of the board, and that has happened before in the district where we've renamed different buildings, and that would definitely be a name that I believe could be considered or would be considered.
Go ahead and continue.
Okay, another question that came in was Nordale has 2 ER programs that will need to be relocated to other schools. Do the schools that they will be moving to have the capacity to take on these students without putting a strain on their current capacity? So for this question, I'm just going to turn it to Mr. Coriella, our Special Ed Executive Director.
All right, thank you, Ms. Moline. So we have begun planning discussions around movement of programs, but no concrete decisions have been made at this point, of course. Moving or opening schools, closing programs occurs yearly in our department. Moving programs or closing programs happens regularly. We open new programs when we need to, and when one is no longer needed, then we move the resources to a different spot. So this is something that we do on a regular basis. We begin by identifying schools that don't have multiple district programs in their buildings. For example, Arctic Light and Hunter, they both have preschool rooms, but they don't house any of our other district-wide programs, our intensive resource programs, nor our extended resource programs. And I can see in my rearview mirror that Jane Bedford is behind me. That's one of the, again, looking at a school that may have capacity, and also, for example, Nordale and Joy already have 3 programs. So if we have a school that already is kind of loaded with programs, it can be a burden on the administration and the staff. So we would try to look at some of those first. We also look at geographic location of where the schools would need to go, where they're starting from and where they need to go, because we'd like to keep students as close to their home school as possible. So we would look at schools that kind of cluster around where the sending program is sitting right now. So basically what we'll do is we'll work alongside first with the assistant superintendents. We'll schedule visits with principals to discuss program moves or changes that would impact the building. We would schedule meetings as soon as possible. What we do is we'll look at potential rooms that could potentially meet the needs of a program moving to the school. We also look at and discuss the impact it might have on students and staff at the school. We discuss those factors with the principal. And again, once all that is done, the information will help determine whether or not a particular school can meet the needs of a new program, new classroom. And then we would also determine what our department needs to do to make that as successful as possible with the least impact on, first students, families, and staff.
Mr. Doran.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Coriel. Along those lines, could you just confirm for me, Anderson has no district-wide?
Yeah, they actually do have a preschool program, but kind of like you mentioned in your last question, there's probably one spot that would go, that the preschool program would probably go to Crawford. One thing that we figured out over the last few years is, sometimes when students are in district programs, especially if they're out in Salcha or in Eielson, is that we end up with students on bus rides for hours in both directions. So it would be our priority to keep that program out on the base. So that doesn't happen. So that would be a natural move next door.
Okay. And for Joy, could you remind me how many district-wide programs they have?
Yes, sir. Joy has 2 intensive resource programs. That's our classrooms that deal with more functional and pre-academic and communication needs. And then we also have a single preschool program. And then at Nordale, we talked about the ER programs, that was in the question, but there's also a preschool program at Nordale as well.
Could I do a follow-up? Okay, and just so we have the full picture, when we talk about capacities or seats available in a building, sometimes that total is actually impacted by having district-wide programs, so they have fewer students because of their needs, but they take up a full classroom. So that being a piece that people and ourselves need to keep in mind when we look at that. Is that correct?
That's exactly correct. We've had programs over the course of years based on the needs and severity of students where we've had 1 or 2 students in a classroom. So you're exactly right, that takes up the capacity of 20 to 30 that might be able to put in that classroom if it was a typical K through 6 classroom. You're exactly right.
Thank you.
I put myself in the queue, and then Ms. Moradi is next. So according to your information, we do have the space if the school closures of Anderson, Nordale, and Joy proceed, that we do have the space for those programs that are in the intensive and the ER rooms that they can fit into the other schools that those students would be going to?
Yeah, I would believe so. And one of the things we did is, first started because we're looking mostly at elementary, meeting with Ms. LaPlante and going through some different scenarios with her. We looked at the capacities of the schools based on, a general movement of the students out of the other schools. And then, schools that still remaining at 60 or 70, we would assume that they would have classrooms to accommodate those needs. But again, it's easy to look at that on paper, but it doesn't work until we go, first of all, with looking with the principal, looking at facilities. So for example, an intensive resource room more likely needs quicker access to a restroom. Maybe it might need a restroom with the handles. Typically, intensive resource rooms would have some greater access to a kitchen or to laundry facilities. And so basically what we've done in the past, and again, this is something we've done pretty much every year, is go with the principal and see, is there a room that maybe, a lot of times a kindergarten room has its own bathroom or has like a split bathroom where we can put two rooms. So we would go around the schools like that and see if we can find a facility that is not going to need a lot of retrofit. And I think that for the most part, we can, with the schools in town, that we can find facilities that with minimal cost, we can use those to meet the needs of those programs.
Thank you. Ms. Marotti?
Thanks, Mr. Coriel, for your explanations. Can you, we've gotten a lot of emails regarding parents of students that are in IR and ER and concerned about the timeline and the impact on their students. And it's really, we feel for that concern. And it seems like if we're able to give them a timeline, I know that nothing is written in stone, but there's some confusion out there too about the timeline of when this will start to impact the students involved. So if the board were to approve the closure of the schools on the 1st, could you give us an estimated timeline of what that would look like for the students and their families?
I don't think it would be unreasonable to think that within a month that we could have some solid recommendations about where classrooms could go. We've already actually, this is, everybody kind of knows that we've had some people out in our schools, and we have already canceled visits 2 weeks in a row. So we're trying to get ahead of those things. We'll get to that as quickly as possible, trying to look at rooms and meeting with principals. I think once we find rooms, and what I'll tell you also is we've identified rooms. So when students are moving into new schools, let's say a 6th grader going to 7th grade, is that we have transition meetings a little more intense than you might have with a typical student who's moving from 6th to middle school. So one thing, as soon as we can identify the schools and the programs, then we could set up transition meetings with parents, students, and then staff from the receiving and the sending schools. So there would be that natural and hopefully individual transition for students and families. But I think that I think that once the decision is made by the school board, that I feel like we can get some good information in several weeks.
Ms. Smith?
Thank you. I've been serving on the Special Ed Advisory Committee, and I also have an intensive resource daughter who is a senior this year. And I was thinking that just for your department, something to consider is I know that some COVID resources are really being dedicated to summer programs for special ed, and that it seems like a great way to address the SEL would be to hold the summer programs in the new schools that students are going to be transitioning to, and that there's plenty of opportunity within that program to have a good summer transition into the new environments. Yep. So I just thought the public should know that that is a resource that might work well.
Yeah, and just to that point, fortunately, we have the funding, I know, at least for this summer, hopefully into next summer, to completely fund the expanded programs we did last summer with a lot of improvements this year, and I hope improvements in the next year, and I hope that they'll will be deemed valuable enough that when CARES money no longer exists, that we'll find funding, because I wouldn't want to give those up at this point. It was when COVID's over, there's still going to be some holes that need to be filled during the summer. Yeah, but we'll take that into account. I like the idea. Thank you.
Mrs. Moline?
Okay, moving on to the next question. It was mentioned that if BEST is moved to a repurposed building, that the district will pay to put a science lab in the repurposed building. There's not currently one there now. Is this true? And if so, what is the cost? So at this point, there's no plan and have been no dedicated funds or really conversations about putting a lab in a repurposed building. We really haven't committed to anything like that at this point at all. With that said, there would be nothing that would limit the school from designated certain areas of the facility for activities like science activities or other specific places. So while there's no plans for that, there's not been any conversation specifically about that. It would provide our best students greater educational space than what's available to them now and really enhance some learning opportunities for that school.
Mrs. Smith?
Thank you. Mr. Minor, there have just been a lot of emails, a lot of questions about why homeschoolers need a building. And I've even heard members of the board say that homeschoolers are at home and that that's why they homeschool, because they want to stay home. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that. I could speak to that, having spent almost a decade homeschooling and almost never being home. And maybe just try to explain what that is about, because I feel like there's a lot of confusion that people think we're setting up a school for people who homeschool. And I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked the question. Having a dedicated facility for BEST would really enhance the workshops and the social gatherings that we're able to have for homeschool students. I think you nailed it precisely that the schooling of our correspondence students takes place all over the community and not necessarily just within their school. And so providing them a space to educate their children and have ongoing workshops with professionals that we can bring into that facility goes a long way with building community in that homeschool program. Other homeschool programs do a lot around building that culture and community among families and students, and that's why they're successful in attracting a variety of students and families to their programs. Homeschool students and families want to get together. They co-op oftentimes on different educational endeavors. So one parent might be successful in teaching social studies and English, and another parent might be successful teaching science and math. So those students could potentially come into that facility every other day or so and have those educational opportunities, switch among co-op parents. And then the gym facility, I think, would also be a huge selling point for our homeschool families. A dedicated space that they can come in and recreate on a regular basis is something that we've heard from families that they would like and appreciate.
Thank you. If I could just follow up with that. There was also some talk that no one consulted homeschool families, or was there any consultation to homeschool families about whether they would even want a program like that? And then also just maybe talk about the fact that students who are in our correspondence program and our e-learning program are still funded students through our school district, and that we have an obligation to meet their educational needs.
Yeah, they're definitely funded students, and one rare area where it could be a potential revenue generation for our school district. We estimate that there's probably 4,500 homeschool students in the borough that aren't currently with our school district, and that's significant revenue that could come to our district. In regards to consultation with families, I've been in the homeschool space for quite a while, and all homeschool programs run up against this facility use issue. homeschool programs want to offer programs and workshops and get-togethers, but you run into limited space and conference space. Our space here is not conducive to hosting students and families in it, and having a space that allows us to be competitive in the marketplace to offer students and families a great educational opportunity is the direction that we'd like to go.
Thank you.
And I would just add to that, that the best parent committee, the best school parent committee is all in favor of this opportunity. So while maybe not formally consulted in a formal way, they have shown interest and, in fact, excitement about the possibility.
Ms. Marati, and then we'll go to Mr. Sampson and then Mr. Doran.
Thank you. This question is for Mr. Minor. So you mentioned that there's 4,500 potential students within the borough. So my first question is, does that include our current students? And then if not our students, where are they? And like with what other program? And then what are the odds that they will come to BEST to generate that revenue that everyone's been talking about?
Yeah, so the biggest the two other biggest homeschool programs in the borough are IDEA and Raven, and then there's several other statewide homeschool programs that offer programs within the borough as well that have students. The odds to students coming over to our program, I don't know that I could definitely speak to that, but I do know that we would be offering something that other programs don't offer, and it's something that families want. They want a dedicated facility for homeschooling to be able to offer other educational opportunities. And so being able to capture that in the marketplace and be the only homeschool program that offers that gives us a competitive advantage.
May I follow up, Ms. Luke?
Yes, thank you.
I'm sorry, I thought that Raven had an idea have buildings like the admin is proposing. Am I wrong?
They do not have a repurposed space like we're talking about. Raven, if you go inside their facility, that's the school I most recently worked for. It's essentially a single hallway with 4 or 5 offices and then a very small conference room in the back. IDEA also does not have a large facility like we're proposing.
I'm sorry, I could have sworn I saw that Raven bought and has a large building off Old Airport.
The Yukon-Koyukuk School District purchased that building, and I don't think I'm at liberty to speak what they're going to use it for. But.
The one off Old, I'm sorry, the facility off Old Airport Way is the Yukon-Koyukuk School District office, and housed within that building is the school district offices and Raven offices and little conference area like Mr. Minor described. And that's not a new purchase. That school district office has been there for several years that I know of. But it splits that space between their Raven homeschool offices. It would be similar to how we have our BEST offices in our district office. So it's a similar sort of setup like that, but no large building that's dedicated to just the homeschool.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Sampson?
Thank you. Although I'm sure homeschool families would love a brand new building to utilize, and I know we can't necessarily speak to the odds of the utilization of that building, speaking in reference to Nordale. This question is for FMD. Can you tell me what is the rationale from an FMD standpoint of closing Nordale, as opposed to a school that is quite obviously much more expensive in terms of costs for maintenance?
So in terms of cost of maintenance, repurposing the school, obviously there wouldn't be any changes to the cost of maintaining.
I'm sorry, can you speak up or into the microphone?
Sorry. From an FMD perspective, if we've got a low enrollment and then we can put those students in other schools and then we can repurpose the schools for what they're offering, then FMD is we're in support of that.
I'm speaking in reference to a facility maintenance. Can you speak to why we're looking at closing a school that is doing so well, this is for facility maintenance. I'm sure Mr. DeGraw can answer it. I'd like facility maintenance to answer the question as to, from your perspective, from your department, why do you see, is there a reason why we're closing down Nordale as opposed to another school that is much, much more dilapidated?
So the intention for Nordale was not to close it, but to repurpose it. And that was one of the differences. So if sorry. Andy, do you want to?
I would ask the public to please keep those comments down. Thank you.
So I guess I'll re-ask the question from the maintenance division, from your department's point of view. Is there a reason why we are repurposing a essentially brand new building as opposed to a building that we've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars doing research, buildings we've done research on, that is much more dilapidated? Can you answer that?
Andy, do you want to help me out on this?
Yeah, if I may, I'll jump in, Mr. Sampson.
I would prefer is that a no? You can't answer the question? Or is it you won't answer the question?
No, that's not the reason. We came to a decision as an executive team, and so Nordale was one of the buildings that we are proposing to repurpose.
Thank you. And I see the whole team is here, and we're here as individuals. Thank you for refusing to answer.
Point of order. We don't need to bully our staff.
So
Mr. DeGraw, yes, and I would just ask that we keep a higher decorum during this meeting. Thank you. Mr. DeGraw?
So from a conditions need perspective, you're correct, Mr. Sampson. There's not a reason to close Nordale, as it's one of our newest buildings in the school district. As we started down this path of facility utilization, we felt like repurposing the many talking points that Mr. Minor just outlined for best homeschool, as well as other, we've talked in the past about potential savings from leases around the borough and different various programs. To us, it made sense to hang on, to close the attendance area of a school, but to retain it for the purpose of repurposing it. And so naturally, we'd want to hold on to a building that was relatively new, that had very little capital long-term maintenance needs. And so, in addition to that, the other factors, so we've just been talking about building condition. There were other factors that administration took into consideration when looking at which schools to consider for closure. One of the main ones is geography. So, there's been some comments publicly that, well, administration didn't look at all the angles. We looked at the entire school district under many different factors. Geography was a big one. So the reason why Nordale is on our list is because of A, geography, and B, condition, but not for closure, to hang on to for the purpose of holding on to that building for programs and other schools in the district. I'm not sure if I answered your question. I hope I did.
You did. Thank you.
Mr. Doran, then Mrs. Smith, and then Mrs. Sanderson.
Okay. I'm going to try and stay in a lane, so I know we'll have some good debate and discussion on Tuesday. But this is actually one of the reasons why I think it's important that we divide the question into three areas of closing schools, relocating schools in a grade configuration consideration. I recognize the real need, and Mr. DeGraw, you've been very good at over multiple years to say this financial situation is going to get worse long before it gets better. And we know the state, we've had declining revenues effectively from the state for 3 years in a row. Actually, arguments could be made for longer than that. We've had declining revenues from the borough for multiple years. A little boost of more than what our request was last year, which we really, really appreciate, but that's millions of dollars down from the borough contributions. So we have a financial consideration. We have a lot of available seats in our district in schools right now. And that's not necessarily due to the fact of people being disconcerted with our schools. Our borough population is down, so fewer people total there. And the 2020 census indicates that the number of children in our borough has declined at a greater number even than the total population. And our childbearing years, parents in that, people in that age group, having fewer children, having them later, or moving out of the borough. And so we have fewer students and we have a lot of seats. And it's a pattern enough to show us that that's not going to turn around anytime soon. And we have a staff shortage, which is a national issue in Alaska, and our district faces it. So with all those considerations, I'll be upfront, and why I'm getting to it is in terms of the best conversation. I'll stay upfront. I'm not in favor of closing Nordale for several reasons. One, the main reason is for repurposing. Why are we closing a school if we're going to just put something else in it? And where we have to, if it's, so that's one of my issues. I am also very concerned it's has a significant neighborhood there with it. It's a new building. It's an ideal size for elementary in actuality. And it's an ideal location to be receiving students from the Joy attendance area. When it comes to best, I think there are two sides of that coin, and a healthy debate could be had. One is, we do know that best grew tremendously during the pandemic. A lot of it because parents, that was the best thing from home anyway. That's the best thing. I'd rather be teaching it myself. I can do this, etc. I don't want to worry whether school's going to be in person, not in person, remote, off, whatever. We had a lot of those questions for the last couple of years. Similar with e-learning. I would not be at all surprised, in actuality, to see those numbers go down rather than go up. We do know that for homeschool, we get less money. Yes, it can be a moneymaker, but are we doing it at the expense of other programs, of other schools, our neighborhood schools? A lot of the things that were mentioned that, we'd like to have speakers in, we'd like to have workshops, we'd like to have this. Well, our neighborhood schools provide those things. Maybe we need to give them more support. And that's part of the issue that I see there. If they need a gym, we have opportunities in many of our schools to give them access to the gym. Our schools are down in numbers. We do know there are a lot of empty spaces in our schools, which is why we're doing, even looking at this. If our schools were full, whatever the finances were, we'd have to fight for those finances. If they were full with students, we would be working to get staff. But there's space. We don't need to close a school in order to provide a space. If they need a classroom for science, we actually have schools that have wings that, because I know the concern was, well, having to go through a current school was compared to a candy store. Well, if that's selling really good things, good for them to see it. But we also have many people who do homeschool, that they do want to be able to not be linked to a building. They want to be able to go to different places. Some of them are traveling. Some of them are going to other parts of the country. And during the pandemic, I know families who moved outside, but they are doing best because they want to keep a connection with the district, but they want to have that outside. They don't need a building. So I think I'm hesitant, and I will end here because I don't want to get into a major debate at this point, perhaps, although we might. To sacrifice a school at this point for a program, I don't think is a fair trade-off. And when I look at all the numbers, I am very concerned with that. But I am strongly, unfortunately, supportive of saying we need to close at least 2 schools this year. I think in some conversation, this will not be the last time we have this conversation. The financial picture is going to be dire for a couple of years. But I think we'd be taking out 900 seats. That is a major step forward. And that's where I'm looking. Separate issues, but I don't see, if we need to invest, I think we can do that, not at the expense of a neighborhood school.
Mr. DeGraw.
Thank you, Ms. Luke. So yeah, I just wanted to appreciate Mr. Doran's his thoughtfulness and approach. He came in, we spent some time together, and I appreciated the opportunity to exchange ideas and provide information, and I've appreciated in my 3.5 years working with Mr. Doran. So having said that, I hear his points, and I'll just say that in the last 2 years, homeschool's always been a significant part of this community, but I think in the last 2 years, the numbers, I think needless to say, have surged. I think you've seen a significant shift in the market just in the last 2 years since the global pandemic occurred. We as a district, we've lost enrollment, so we're on the wrong trajectory. And strategically speaking, when you're I'm going back to before I was in education, I was in the business world, finance, and you look at we're in the customer service business. We're a school district. We are in the customer service business. The community is our customers. And we can either, the marketplace is shifting, has shifted, you could say. It already has. And either we evolve as an organization, as a customer service organization, or we don't evolve. We try to do our best to provide products and services that meet the needs of the customers in our market. And it's administration's position that a repurposed building, and Mr. Doran and I had a playful debate. He's said several times 2 schools, and I tell him I'll get you to 3 eventually. Because it's my firm belief that we need to close 3 buildings, and that's in our recommendation. But not only the overhead and operating cost savings of closing 3 attendance areas, but then the potential for an additional revenue stream on top of those expenditure reductions by better serving, by offering an enhanced product to what's become a more significant percentage of the education market in the borough. And we feel strongly that, the phrase from the movie, if we build it, they will come. If we build it and we implement it effectively, we feel that they'll come. So I appreciate Mr. Doran's position, and he has many valid points, and I just wanted to provide the perspective that administration's coming from.
Thank you. We have Mrs. Smith, and then I am in the queue, and then Ms. Sanderson, and then Mr. Sampson.
Thank you. So if I may, I had just a lot of points that I wanted to address. But I, first of all, would like to address the accusation that the borough that the district wants to repurpose the building with the plan that it will generate revenue. And my understanding, sitting on this board and listening to our administration justify the repurpose, was that this repurposing would be to provide the best educational opportunity to students who are currently somewhat marginalized by our services. That the e-learning students, which is an entire new program for our district, have no location to meet with their students. They have a desk here in some offices that didn't exist just a short time ago. So they clearly don't have appropriate space for a program that has hundreds of students. And then the homeschool program, I hear Mr. Doran's understanding that these are people who do not need a space. But the fact is that they are our students. And that they deserve the best space possible. And I also heard Mr. Doran say that neighborhood schools have those programs, and that putting the kids through the candy store of a neighborhood school would be good to entice them into the program. And I am just so frustrated at that train of thought. It is not to be argumentative or personal, but it is an old thought. Every child belongs to their family, and their families have the right to make the appropriate choice for those students. And when their families have chosen to direct their education, we should be their partner. And I think that was Mr. Minor, Mr. DeGraw have both clearly said here, is that we want to provide personalized learning, which is part of our mission, and that we want to do that as a partner with every parent in our school district. Those 4,500 students are students that go to other homeschool programs. And the reason that they go to those other homeschool programs is our program, which is paid for with their tax dollars, is not meeting their needs. And we want to meet their needs because that is our mission. That is our goal as a school district, is to meet the needs of every single student in our district. Not every student who wants to show up and possibly be indoctrinated by a teacher who does not have the best interest of their family in mind.
Point of order.
I called it. Thank you.
I understand. I do have a question. I was wondering if it matters what building we close. Regarding Nordale being a great school, we don't want to close it. So does it really matter what building we close? And this is just the recommendation of the administration. The board could close any building that we want, correct?
Well, let me just add. So I mentioned as other factors for consideration for closure, in addition to geography, you have capacity and existing enrollment as well. Those are other factors. So let's look in the geographic area. You have Ladd Elementary School in very close proximity to Nordale. Significantly higher capacity of the building and significantly higher enrollment. So you're looking at the number of kids you'd be impacting. Again, same exact profile, a neighborhood school. And so we looked at that, and that's why the decision was Nordale Elementary, smaller enrollment, smaller capacity, same, very similar profile of buildings. And so, it does matter. It did matter in our deliberations, our long deliberations, as we went through all the different scenarios, and that's why we landed on Nordale.
Thank you. I have a question about when we talk about students, our numbers, and next year, when we look at our schools of choice, our charter schools, on our school capacity projections for next year, it states that we have 1,630 students that are currently or projected to attend schools of choice or charter schools. Do we know what year those charter schools, the first charter school opened? Wasn't it Chinook that was the first one?
Chinook.
Okay.
I don't even want to guess.
Has any building been built since that, new buildings been built since that school opened? And I apologize, this might be just.
Since Chinook opened as a charter, has there been any new?
Or since we've gotten charter schools here in the interior of Alaska, have any new school buildings been built?
Just to let, Chinook started in 1996. And actually, in 2002, and I'm looking at their history, in 2002, they moved into their current building. They started in Chena Elementary building out on Fort Wainwright.
Okay. And I think when I'm looking at these numbers, because we are talking about the possible closure of 3 different buildings, and when we look at the students who have chosen these schools of choice, which are 1,630, and we look at the possibility of 900 elementary students within Fairbanks proper, Nordale, Joy, and we have not right-sized the footprint of our schools. We've actually expanded the footprint of our schools since some of the charter schools have been built. It looks to me as though there's still more students that have gone to these charter schools and the expanded. So if you look at just the charter school numbers, it would warrant the closure of 2 in-town buildings. Can you just elaborate and make sure I'm doing the math correctly?
Absolutely. As you're verbalizing your points, Ms. Luke, I'm just looking at the numbers. Yeah, roughly 1,600 charter school students. I've said several times in different public venues that we're currently maintaining more square footage now with 12,000 students than when we had 15,000 students 20 years ago, or however many years ago. 20 years ago, we had somewhere in the neighborhood of 14 to 15,000 students. We're now maintaining more square footage. We don't own the charter buildings, they're leased, but we pay for those leases because we fund the charter schools. So yeah, those numbers ironically line up relatively closely. 1,600 charter school students. I would say the total capacity of the 3 buildings we're looking at is probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,700. And so those numbers alone on the surface would justify looking at a minimum of 2 schools and in my opinion, 3.
Okay, and that's not even taking into account the change in our student population.
Correct. That's just offsetting the number of students that have left regular attendance area schools over the past 20, 25 years, whenever our first charter school popped up.
Great, thank you. Mrs. Sanderson?
Thank you, President. Excuse me. So in 96, when Chinook opened, it opened its doors with 75 kids. And we have had numerous discussions over the past years about, the board even tasked Mr. Marner with doing some promotion for our best school after a presentation that he presented to the board. And we still have talked over the years that we have not budgeted enough for adequate advertisement of that school. And when we talk about the repurposing of Nordale, we need a full-fledged e-learning academy because those numbers have increased, if I'm not mistaken. We talked about putting bridge there because of the enormous amount of money we're spending in a lease to house that program there. And it's, I don't think it's been adequate for the program, but they've managed the program from that building. And then we've talked about our best. And because of the location, I can see that best could work there because it's close to university, it's close to downtown, it's close to the museums, it's close to everything that families and parents and staff, could offer more and expand the program. That's something we've tasked Mr. Marnock with doing over the years. I believe that we are at a transition and a crossroads of being able to provide and to expand and to polish up what we do offer to our families. We have transit families, we have families that are, all established families. We have second, third, fourth, fifth generation families that are utilized our facilities. And we haven't kept up. And so now we have this task in front of us that we have to make some decisions. I think it's an opportunity always to look at how we can better reinvent ourselves and present a higher quality for our students and staff and for our community. The community's been pretty vocal about what they want and how we need to service the needs of our families and our students. And again, I just want to end by saying, what we have provided, our students and our staff, they have excelled, but it's been under great stress. And I think it's time we take some of the stress off of the families and our staff and students and really go far afield outside the box of what we can provide for students by polishing that up and presenting it in a different package. And it's not what everybody desires, but we are in the business of educating students. We have a strategic plan that talks about personalized learning and helping our students excel in what they have chosen to do. And I just want to find a solution that makes that work. And that we can have input. We've had a task force. Now the board has to make decisions. And I'm ready to move forward to make a decision so that we can offer a higher quality product to our community and to our teachers and staff and students in our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sanderson. Mr. Sampson, Ms. Smith, and then Mr. Doran.
Thank you, President Luke. It's kind of ironic that you touched on the fact that we are paying for charter schools, or should I say the borough, the taxpayers are paying for both charter schools that the borough does not own. It's privately held schools. And at the same time, they're paying for schools that we're pulling out of. It's kind of like a double whammy. If you wanted to save some money, you would keep the school that was bonded by the community, and you would go ahead and close a charter school. That's just simple math. But anyhow, the whole question, the whole debate, all the hot button issues here is surrounds Nordale. And the question is why are we closing a school if we're just going to put something else into it? Well, that's the wrong question. The question is why are we closing a school? Is it because we want to put something else into it? Or is it because we're looking to close a school? Well, it's a little bit of everything, and we do a song and dance about all that. But the fact of the matter is we're in financial woes, and we need to close some schools. It's not a question. It's not a question. These are statements, folks. So what brought us to this conversation is a supposed $17.3 million deficit. If we didn't have a $17.3 million deficit, I promise we would not be talking about closing schools, okay? So the reason we're talking about closing schools is because we have a massive deficit. I don't mind closing schools to save money. I don't mind closing schools with one of the motivating factors being increasing the capacity usage of surrounding schools, thereby enriching the program within the school that had increased students come to it. That's great. We heard a bunch of principals say, I'd love for another school to close and have a bunch of kids come to my school. Then we'd have an enriched program, right? That's great. And in the event that we're closing schools to increase the capacity usage of surrounding schools, you could simply just close any school you want. That would suffice. That would serve to the ends of the means that you're looking for. Close one school, increase the numbers in another. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why we're closing schools. But the main reason we're closing schools is to save money, folks. And I don't mind closing a school to save money. And if the school's closed and we end up putting in a BEST program or this program or that program, that's fine. That's a separate conversation in my opinion, okay? So when we talk about closing 2 old schools and one, I'm gonna call it a brand new school, I say to myself, uh-oh, what does that do to us down the road? Well, you just closed a school that's brand new and you lost an opportunity to close an actual decrepit school that costs our maintenance department, the taxpayers, a lot of money. So when you go closing a brand new school and you start going down the list of the old decrepit ones, our ability to actually close the old decrepit ones diminishes because our deed capacity might be close to being maxed out. So if you want to talk about closing a brand new school, I don't even want to talk about BEST. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. That's the way I look at it, especially when we're paying for charter schools.
Thank you, Ms. Luke. Yeah, Mr. Sampson makes many good points. I would agree with him. I think early in his comments, he said the main purpose that we're looking at here of closing schools is the operating costs and the overhead costs. Funding buildings for X number of students and running those buildings at 60% capacity or 55%, that's not an efficient use of our dollars. Again, as we've mentioned, I won't belabor the point. We see, so that would still be saved in the event of closing Nordale. Those costs would be saved. We see it as an additional revenue stream, additional opportunity for the district to serve our entire district, the benefits, potential benefits of BEST. I won't belabor that point again. And Mr. Sampson does make a good point. The area that we would lose in closing the attendance area of the newer school is that we lose the opportunity of closing another school with higher CIP needs that could potentially be a burden on taxpayers down the road. That is a good point. And we've communicated this in the past. If the board chose the path of not repurposing a building, administration would not be in favor of closing Nordale Elementary.
Mrs. Smith and then Mr. Doran,
Thank you.
and Ms. Marati.
I just have 2 questions. The first one is it fair to say that repurposing or not, we would be looking to close 3 schools? So we're not really sacrificing a school for a program. It's only the repurposing determines which building would be best to close.
Correct. It's our position. We need to close 3 attendance areas for the next school year. And that the 3 attendance areas, schools that we have suggested would save an estimated $3 million. Given the financial deficit that we are facing right now, savings of $3 million in that area will reduce $3 million of staff cuts, direct staff cuts that we will be forced to make if we don't take this action.
Thank you. And if I could have another question that is not a follow-up, it's just a separate.
Go ahead, Ms. Smith.
I know that the board is having an in-depth workshop regarding charter schools, but I just wanted to put it out there that I was confused by the statements made earlier that the way that the borough taxpayers are paying for the charter schools in some direct way, because it was my understanding that it's the money follows the student to the charter schools, and that we don't pay any additional money. So it actually is more like state money and federal money that's following those students, and they are maybe funded at a lower rate actually than a student sitting in Nordale or another school. And the borough taxpayers are not actually paying for those charter schools. Am I confused?
That's a good question. I would say roughly 75 cents of every dollar we're paying would come from state and federal sources, because 25% of our overall revenue comes from local sources. So, just to clarify, I don't remember my exact words, but I just want to make sure I'm clear. I intended to say that the school district is funding additional square footage because we are providing the revenue to the charters that they use to pay their annual leases. And so I think it would be accurate to say that local taxpayers are funding a roughly 25% share of that bill, because that's the relative percentage of our overall income.
So just to be clear, we're funding that because those students would otherwise be in our schools and bring in normal funding. So it's like a subsidizing.
And also, just to clarify, charter students generate the same revenue that any other student generates in the district. And yes, if those students weren't in a charter, we have plenty of capacity where we would not need to add any additional facilities if they were in regular attendance area schools. So it is an extra cost.
Okay, I just wanted to have that in my mind, because somehow I thought that the charters were like not drawing any or very minimal cost, and 25% is actually a lot.
Sure.
So
and if I could just make it, if I may, I don't want my comments to be taken as negative and derogatory towards our charter schools in our district by any way, shape, or form. I'm just providing the financial reality. The charter schools, the revenues required by the district to charter schools are driven by state statute. So that's the position that we've taken with charter schools. So we don't control that. That's not a decision that's able to be made here at the local level. It's a state determination that they've made. And so, but I just want to be clear that my comments are just simply to provide information, context, for decision making and perspective for the board, not as an attack on charters.
and just Mr. DeGraw, if you the charter schools are there to provide a service that our regular schools are not providing. That's why they have to have a charter that's really specific. Like they do something different than what we do. They have like a different educational platform. Anyway, we'll talk about that at another time in our charters. I also don't want it to be construed that we have the option as a board to close all the charter schools and stop closing our regular schools.
Correct, we do not. I would say charters are another way that we offer a unique resource and educational product to members of our community that desire it.
Thank you. Mr. Doran, then Ms. Marati, and then Mr. Sampson.
Okay, a couple of things. One is a clarification on numbers. Earlier, it was tossed out at approximately 1,700 students in charter schools. That's incorrect. We actually have in K-8 schools 755 seats available there, and basically a full 145, 712, so it's only 900 seats that are out. And how many are filled at any given time? It's usually pretty close to that, but just so there's not a confusion in terms of those numbers. One of the things that I was thinking as some comments were made, I've already stated my position on Nerdale. One of the things to factor in for us is Nordale and Denali were new buildings were bonded at the same time. And I know it took at least 2, I believe it was 3 efforts to bond those. So there was a very significant commitment from our community in a relatively recent time, because they are the number 2 newest buildings in our district. That our community, the whole community, really got behind that. And it took time to get to that. And actually, both schools were considered at that time. Do we close them? Do we close one of them? Do we not? There was a task force at that time. The decision was no, we keep both. And the community fully supported that. And we had the bond issue with that. And I think that's a piece to keep in mind. The other and kind of a question, and I think we may, I know a request was when we're looking at budget, let's at least get some broad strokes where this fits within that. We have approximately 17 million we've been talking about for a deficit. This is one little piece of it. It's not, it's a relatively small piece, but a significant piece. You know, I don't want to minimize it, but it's less than 20%. So we have that to consider when we get to our budget considerations. Where are the additional cuts, reductions going to come? There's also the question of requesting additional funds from the borough, going to the state. I think the borough is much more likely to be responsive to us, especially when they see that we have to close 2 schools. That is significant impact on the borough. And so, and on our community. So we have to have that conversation. And also with the numbers, if I understand them correctly, on the CARES, we have approximately 14.5 million of CARES money that would be available for budgeting for future years. I don't want to be short-sighted in terms of saying that we want to use all of that for the FY23 year, because we are looking at a financial crisis for multiple years, and we have to keep that in mind. Which is one reason why we saved some of the CARES money and did not spend it all for this current fiscal year, because we knew we were facing this cliff. So we're not at the point because we haven't gotten the budget yet, but keeping in mind that we have some of those, so really what are we trading off at a particular point? And I don't want to minimize the seriousness of what we have to do. I think, yes, we have to close some schools. You know, I can get to 2. You don't have me to 3. We get there. And if there's that third one, which it is, and whether it's this year or next year, we have to seriously consider looking at that. But so that's where I'm trying to balance that out in the whole picture of the finances, how we approach for our community to understand how serious this is for us to actually be closing a school for financial reasons is absolutely significant. And because up until a decade ago, we were looking at increasing spaces. Some of it is attributable for students who have gone to other, whether it be charter. In the past 2 years, we've had a lot of people go to e-learning and to homeschool, But we do know there was a major impetus that led to that increase. And what are we trading off? And I guess I would specifically say if part of our budget thing, because it comes up every budget cycle, we look at PTR. And CARES was used to keep PTR status quo for this year. But if we start raising that, we're again taking a hit to our neighborhood schools. And so I'm trying to look at that big picture and keep that in mind. So more comment than question, but the information that has been exchanged is helping to make me work through that. Does that make sense?
Mr. DeGraw?
So, thank you, Mr. Doran. A lot to unpack there. I guess I just, so 17.5 million is the deficit that we've been looking at. That number I'm in the process of updating to higher because of continuing reduced enrollment. We're going to be in the neighborhood of 275 to 300 students below our final approved budget that we're currently in, projected for next year. So that 17.5 million is going to go up. You mentioned, relatively small percentage of the overall deficit. I agree. However, we've known from the beginning we're going to pull multiple arrows out of the quiver to tackle this. No one thing is going to solve that size of a deficit. 2-year deficit, I've been telling folks and publicizing it's over $20 million over 2 years, because the following year we have additional hold harmless loss. The final year step down will be FY24. So additional revenue loss from the state, as well as every year we give only a step. A step alone to the district costs $2 million. $2 million for a step alone. So we're looking at a $20+ million deficit. The total salaries for the entire ESSA bargaining unit for an entire year is $25 million. And we're looking at I'm estimating right now the 2-year deficit is going to be $22 to $23 million. So that's the magnitude of what we're looking at. So is $3 million savings from 3 schools a huge percentage of that overall mountain? No, but I would venture to say that it would likely be the single biggest arrow we could pull from the quiver or card that we could play, the single largest. And we've talked many times about administration's feelings that there aren't really many ways. When you look at cuts, at budget cuts, virtually every cut I can think of impacts students negatively, either directly or indirectly. And we've talked often throughout this process about our thoughts and feelings that this will actually improve services to children. Because of the vacancies district-wide that we currently have, we're having a hard time filling counselor positions, food service positions, nursing positions, teacher aide positions, PE positions, music positions, just goes on and on and on and on. You go to any school building right now, and the absences due to the conditions right now with COVID, are challenging. But even without that, just the sheer number of vacancies we have district-wide, because the challenge we face, just like every other organization all over the world is facing, by reducing our footprint, our physical footprint, we're confident that we can fill those positions better. We can reduce the inefficiencies of too much support staff covering too much square footage relative to the number of students that we have. And so our strong feeling is that we'll actually improve the overall product for students and services that we can offer to students. So it's really, for us, it's a win-win proposition. And so, yeah, it's 2 schools, 3 schools, that's ultimately a decision that the board will end up making. my strong recommendation is to close 3 schools. And because if we don't, that's $1 million lost potentially of savings that we can reduce in cuts that we would have to make in other areas in the budget.
And I would just like to add to Mr. DeGraw's comments, and something that Mr. Doran said earlier about, where we would find those cuts. And that's the big concern, is that we would have to find those cuts in staffing. And so now we're getting down to impacting students by finding those cuts in another place. So if we don't save the 3 million from 3 schools, and we just do 2, then we've got to find $1 million in staff cuts. So that's where it starts impacting our students.
And just to carry that point home, then our position is we keep a school open that we don't have a need for, we don't have a physical need for, and the student counts to cover those. We can't fill, we have vacancies there to begin with, and then we have to cut additional staff to make up for the lost savings because we didn't close the school. So it's kind of just this vicious cycle that we see.
Go ahead, Mr. Doran.
Okay. First, I want to make sure I understood your numbers right. You said that the drop in, you're projecting a drop of enrollment for next year of about 270 students.
Correct.
Okay.
And
due to
that point, Mr. I want to be careful. We have dates that we're set to present the proposed budget to the board. I don't want to get out in front of that and get too specific.
Okay.
So I'd like to provide specifics tonight, but I'm just unable to.
Okay. And the other ballpark, you said that we're, instead of a 17.5 million that we've been talking about through today, you're saying that's now 22, 23.
Over the 2 years.
Oh, over
so
2. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Correct.
I think that's really important
Yeah.
because we're talking 17.5 for
Yeah.
2023, and then
21 over 2.
I'm sorry.
21 million over 2 years.
So
It's been
another
17.
4 million the following year.
Correct.
Okay, and I think that's really important distinction
Yes.
because we tend to mix numbers. Okay, with that, and I know we're talking cuts, but I know we've also, I think there's been some comment by the board in the past, I can't remember exactly when, so I won't quote anybody or stuff, but I said it tonight. We can ask for additional money if that's our need. And I just don't want to rule that out and say that they're, and I don't want to make it an untenable position for administration. When we get into budget, we'll do some, hopefully modified nickel and diming, but we'll be looking carefully there. But I think that's an important thing. What is our trade-off with this, and really looking at how, what school, I think that has been issued for that third one if we need, whether it's this year or next year, we need to get there, basically, the way projections are. I do want to just say if my numbers correct, if I read the numbers correctly, Nordale is in the top half of the occupied space of our elementary schools. And if they picked up some of the Joy students, which they're in close proximity for, that would boost them even higher with that. So I just want to make that observation and using the numbers that are here.
That would depend on whether we stay 7-8 at our middle schools or go 6-8 at our middle schools.
Yes, because, and the observation there is that if we do go 6-8, and I hope we can separate these conversations, they're complementary, but they're different, and I think they need their own spotlighting. But if we go 6-8, it does mean that all except for one elementary school goes down in capacity, and some by 10 to 12%, which puts very I mean, we have to be aware of that spotlight on where we look at, whether it's middle school, elementary school. If we go 6-8, we are closing at least one, maybe two elementaries because we're really bringing them down. Now, those capacities would have to be balanced out a little bit with district-wide programs that are taking up full classrooms and, in a sense, impact the fullness of those schools. So those are just some factors. Thank you.
Sorry, I don't want to be long-winded. I think that, but this is a huge topic, and so I apologize for some of my long-winded remarks, but just I feel like it's very necessary, and I this is good back and forth. So yes, reducing capacities, Mr. Doran, there still is the benefit of the reduced number of schools, therefore the fewer vacancies, and able to fill up the positions more easily, and that challenge that we're facing currently. So yes, point taken. Many of those capacities stay at lower levels, but we gain efficiencies nonetheless. The reason I want to point out, make sure I'm pointing out why I point out the 2-year deficit is because nobody expects to tackle this in 1 year. So it's very important to talk about it then in a 2-year outlook. So if we were just going to tackle that in 1 year, hey, it's just a $17 million deficit, boom, we're done. But nobody's under the illusion that we're going to do that. So it's going to be a 2-year process. That's going to be the plan that we're going to put forward, the administration will put forward in our proposed budget. And I just can't stress enough that it's important that we obviously it's not going to be exactly, we would vote that it is exactly what we proposed. But we respect the fact that the board will work that proposed budget, and there will likely be changes. But I think it's very important. The pressure will be there to continue to kick the can down the road, and to just cover it with this or cover it with that, and if we do that, the danger is of falling off a massive financial cliff all at once. And that would be catastrophic. So the plan that administration is going to propose is going to be a 2-year step down approach, where we make reductions in year 1, and then we make the needed reductions in year 2 to have a soft, I don't even want to say soft landing, is not a crash landing where we explode into pieces. It's just, and so just to give context, my final talking point on this topic, hopefully, is if the plan that we're going to propose in a couple of weeks will still involve, we're going to propose utilizing COVID relief funds, CARES. We're going to propose closing buildings. We're going to propose some revenue enhancements. We're going to propose expenditure cuts. All of the above. We're going to play a lot of cards. And that plan that we're going to present, it's going to be painful. It's going to be some shock and awe. And we will still have an $8 to $10 million deficit for year 2. For the second year, we'll still have $8 to $10 million to cut. And so, I say this just to continue to remind folks of the magnitude of the hole we're in, and just the need for some hard decisions. And I would say hard decisions, but the right decisions for the district based on the circumstances that we find ourselves in.
If it's okay, I'll put you back in the queue. Ms. Marotti has been waiting very patiently for the last while. So we're going to go to Ms. Marotti, and then Mr. Sampson, and then back to Mr. Doran.
Thank you. I have a statement and 2 questions. My statement is that, so Mr. DeGraw mentioned that reducing the number of schools fills up the vacancies, and maybe we should be looking at why we cannot fill the vacancies, and focus on retention as much as we're looking at closing schools. My questions are, if we don't repurpose a building, and it's been stated that admin's not in favor of closing Nordale, then what school does the admin recommend to be closed? And my second question is, how much did the borough provide last year for their contribution? And what is the max that the borough is able to provide?
So I'll start with the what school would we recommend? We've done some preliminary look at that, and there hasn't been one that has risen to the top as the next best choice. We would need to get some priorities from the board. If it's a priority of geography, we have to look at the number of elementary schools on the west side of town versus the number of schools on the east side of town, if that's the priority. If the priority is Title I considerations, we'll have to look at different buildings. There just hasn't been one that's risen to the top. But what I will say is that we have looked at every single in-town elementary school and haven't found a surfacing choice. So that's kind of, we could close Nordale, although the case has been made that it's one of the newer buildings, which is why it wouldn't raise to the top in the age. So is it age? Is it location? Is it population? All of these factors is what played into identifying the schools to close. So if it's not Nordale, it would be not Nordale because it's a newer school. So we would have to go back and start like prioritizing again which school we do want to close if we're not going to repurpose. The task force did recommend closing Nordale as a part of their recommendation. I mean, we could certainly do that, but it is one of our newer buildings. So we would have to go back and refine our look and see. So we don't have a name to put forward now. So that's the question about which other school. And for the second question, I think Mr. DeGraw is the best one to answer that about the ask and the maximum ask of the borough.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Moline. Just want to make sure it was the maximum. What's the maximum? And then what was the first question, Ms. Marati?
Last fiscal year, how much did the borough provide in a dollar amount? And what was the max that the borough is able to provide?
Yeah, so what they provided was $49,445,400. That's off the top of my head, so I'm going to double check that after we go to the next question. And speaking of that, yes, Mr. Dorn, thank you. A little over 700 charter students. So I did miss, I included BEST and ALS students in my 1,600. So, and then the maximum allowed, Ms. Marati, is just over 66 million.
Thank you.
Mr. Sampson.
Somebody get that guy a soda pop. I guess I want to say right off the bat, I get so tired of hearing about how we can ask for more money from the borough. As if we're going to strategize our plan off of asking for more money. We're going to go into this with the money that we have, not with the money that we want. But yes, we can ask the borough for more money. It's been said like at every single meeting, and I'm sure we will. Also, I get tired of hearing, where are we going to make the cuts? If, say, 90% of your budget is on wages, health, and welfare, about 90% of your cuts is going to come from wages, benefits, and health care. Unless someone can get really, really creative. And that's what we're doing here today. The one place where it's not going to hit the kids, as in the one place where it's not going to cost, minimal teaching positions, In my opinion, and the name of the game is to keep as many teachers as possible. I want to keep as many teachers as possible. And when we make the point that if we go 6-8, sixth graders are now no longer with the elementary kids, which means our elementary schools are now not at capacity for maximum resource usage and enrichment. That opens the door to closing more schools. That opens the door to keeping more teachers. I think it's a good idea. I hate to say I'm in favor of closing more schools. It doesn't sound good. But in essence, what we're doing is we're keeping teachers. That should be the focus. I want to go back to the fact that the public has funded well over $1 billion worth of schools in this community, you know, and as for the buildings. And that money, the buildings that we're in now and our students are in, that money, these buildings came from the taxpayers, from us, from the people listening. That is separate from the money that we get on a yearly allocation from the borough, from the municipality. Granted, it's 25% of the overall money that we get yearly. It doesn't change the fact that the taxpayers are paying and have paid for all the buildings. And we operate our budget off of our revenue stream, of which 25% comes from the borough. When you spend $1 on a charter school's rent, that was $1 that we could have spent towards a teacher, towards a student's education, okay? Secondly, I also want to point out that every dollar we get for education is paid for by taxpayers. Just because 25% comes from there's revenue from the state and the federal, that's still us. We're still paying for that. And so I don't like to, you know, it's a fair point when you say, you know, locally, you know, but from the state, oh, we don't pay state taxes. That's free money. Nothing's free, folks. Well, there's only one thing free. But very little is free in this life. And every single dollar that comes in here is from the taxpayers. And so, you know, wise stewardship of our resources. And I think I think, you know, that arrow that Mr. DeGraw pointed out that we're going to use that's going to have the least impact on the students is school closures. And we're going to see more of them. And I really hesitate on closing a brand new school when we've got more holes to fill. No question.
Thank you, Mr. Sampson. Mr. Doran?
Thank you. One observation, just historically fact, is the borough's local contribution, I believe, had tapped out at 55 million and has been going down since. To address the point that Mr. Borough made about 2 years, this is really a multi-year, and to reinforce it, if I am correct in broad numbers, we actually made about 17 million in reductions this fiscal year. And when we started the budget, I think we were looking at 27, but we were able to cover approximately 10 million with CARES money, which I mentioned in terms of we've been in this for several years, and we will not be out. I would say will not be out in 2 years. It's going to continue unless the state invests in education and our borough invests in education. And I do want to say that I think our borough and our community has made tremendous investments over the year, and we do have a lot of good support, so I don't want to minimize that in any way. It has not quite kept up with costs. The question I've got, you might not have this at hand, so just put it in the hopper. We've talked a lot about vacancies, and I know we've done Band-Aids around those vacancies. Sometimes we've had retired people covering them but we have a significant number of vacancies. I believe that has lasted through the year. I want to say I've heard numbers in 20. I hesitate to say a number because I'm not sure. But those, if they've been vacancies, in some ways they are true savings that we have not expended this year. Because, and at those positions, they can easily add up to $1 million and more, multi-million. So maybe as we go forward, just, that'll take time to figure out where that is. And it may not be really in the consideration, but it's something that crossed my mind as we've talked about vacancies and stuff, so.
Yes, a vacancy that goes unfilled throughout the year is a savings that would go towards bolstering our fund balance, which is currently at 0 officially. So that is a benefit, Mr. Doran, absolutely. The problem is that even if it's a vacancy, we're still budgeting for the position because we intend to fill it to serve students. And if I know you're all aware of the conditions out in school buildings right now, is folks are running pretty thin. They're running on empty because it's challenging, right? And so we're still budgeting for it, and we're still recruiting for those positions because we need those positions to help kids.
Thank you. And could you put me back in the key? I have 2 questions from emails that we've gotten over the last few days.
Go ahead.
One of the questions that's come up several places is about Title I funds. And on one hand, we say that Title I funds follow the student. Having been principal of a Title I school, though, there's a threshold, and students who are currently getting Title I may go to a school that is still below the title threshold for funding. I know we don't know exact numbers in any way, but I think it's just important to clarify that we get a dollar amount per student. It doesn't necessarily follow a student because we have students who we get funding for, but they're not in a Title I school. So I think just that clarity if we could.
I'm sorry. Were you finished with the question, Mr. Doran?
Yes, I just want to make sure that we have clarity on that for the public.
Yeah, and I appreciate that question. That was one of the questions on our list here. We haven't gotten through our list, but we'll go ahead and jump to that one. So we did get that question, and I'm going to ask Ms. Marquand to expand a little bit on how that might work. We did have quite a bit of discussion around our Title I schools and what that would mean for our students. So and Ms. Marquand will expand on that and hopefully shed some clarity and some light. So I'll turn it over to her.
Thank you, Ms. Moline. I do want to just take a minute to answer the specific question that was asked, and looking at money following students and services following students. So the question that I would ask is, what kind of Title I services is that student currently receiving? Direct support from McKinney-Vento, Migrant Education, or foster care would definitely follow the individual student. Whereas school-wide program services, such as at a Title I school, like Nordale or Joy, that would not necessarily follow them individually if their next school is not identified as a Title I school. Please keep in mind that Title I funding goes to those schools with exceptionally high concentrations of poverty to establish a school-wide program. Other indirect services provided at Title I schools, such as professional development and instructional coaches, may follow that individual student, shall the board choose to close those schools. However, the in-depth training the teachers at Joy and Nordale have received over the past many years is going to go with students should those teachers end up at a non-Title I school. The high-quality instruction provided at these schools would then likewise disperse across the district, enriching whatever schools these particular professionals land in. High-quality engagement is also a norm and an expectation at a Title I school, and families really enjoy the family engagement activities. Therefore, I would anticipate that these relocated staff would take these expectations and ideas behind family engagement with them to their new school sites. I'm also prepared to talk just a little bit more in depth about our district's funding eligibility determination, because maybe you're thinking as well, well, what's going to happen next? How exactly does that look? And so I thought I would take this opportunity to talk about that, especially for those who aren't necessarily in education, to bring that clarity to the table. So Title I Part A is one component of the Elementary and Secondary Act Consolidated Application that provides educational program assistance to school districts and schools with high numbers of students from low-income families to ensure students receive fair, equitable, and high-quality education in order to close an achievement gap. To qualify for this federal funding, yes, the borough, the district does use the statutory formula for using the National School Lunch Program applications and eligibility, commonly referred to as free and reduced lunch or meals, to determine poverty percentages based on the entire enrollment of our district in order to qualify for funding. So we look at that as a whole, all students enrolled. Then at the district level, we use the federal option to identify schools below a 75% poverty rank and rank order them by grade span groupings while meeting federal requirements within that individual school's free and reduced meal percentage. And it needs to be meeting the 40% or above threshold that we've set. So that gets determined locally here at the district level once those funds come in by looking at the whole picture of the district itself. Currently, our district elects to use, for the 21-22 and previously, service delivery plans of the school-wide program. So we identify the schools to receive the Title I funding, which allows the school community to consolidate this federal funding, other state and local funds that we've discussed before, to upgrade the entire educational program. It's like braiding all the funds together. We know that research suggests that schools that have a relatively high poverty rate, students' needs are more widespread throughout that whole school population. And though the school's not required through this approach to identify individual children as being eligible for those services, or to provide certain students with those supplemental benefits, the overall focus of the program is addressed on meeting the needs of low achieving children and those at risk of not meeting those academic achievements. So upon further redistricting, if it becomes apparent that many of our free and reduced lunch students are at a specific school and they don't necessarily reach that highest threshold that we've looked at, the district can look at changing the service delivery model. We do have options in there. Not typically the way the district goes, but until we collectively know the direction that we're going, I can provide more clarity behind that. But I can't quite at this time. I also just wanted to speak just a little bit more aside from Title I specific funding to talk about other individual supports that economically disadvantaged students have the opportunity and to have. So since Title I Part A funding is used to create school-wide support programs. It's really just one component of our federal funding package, which is awarded to the district with the ESEA consolidated application that I mentioned previously. So therefore, our district uses another portion of the allocation to provide support across the district, like I mentioned before, the McKinney-Vento program. This ensures that students experiencing homelessness during the course of a school year have equal and full access to the same educational opportunities as provided to other students. We use the funding to facilitate school enrollment, attendance, opportunities for participation in extracurricular activities, reducing barriers to academic achievement, facilitating higher education, and coordinating with outside agencies to identify and connect them with supports. We're fortunate to secure other grants not necessarily associated with Title I within our district to further support economically disadvantaged students across the district. A portion of our ESEA consolidated app is earmarked to provide well-rounded educational opportunities and safe and healthy students. And our district has a multi-tiered system of support for social emotional learning. These grant funds are specifically allocated to fund our social service managers, to provide individual mental health supports, and to purchase instructional supplies and materials. Other grant-funded programs aimed at supporting economically disadvantaged students included our AK Rises program, which offers mental health clinician services in our schools, and our 21st Century Community Learning Center after-school program. Our Migrant Education program is also funded through the consolidated application, and it provides supplemental funds for our migrant program, to meet the identified needs of migrant children that result from their migratory lifestyle. The primary goals here certainly help individual eligible students reach challenging academic standards, graduate from high school, and have the supports targeted towards increasing academic achievement. I wouldn't want to leave out our English language learner program, which also receives supplemental funding, as well as a component of our ESEA consolidated application that assists the district in providing support for classroom teachers in the implementation of best practices for English learners. And these are just a few examples of the individual support programs that are available to our most vulnerable students.
Thank you. Mr. Doran, did you have a follow-up?
Not a follow-up. I have another question, different topic.
Okay, and then after that, I'd like to go to Mrs. Moline to complete the questions.
Okay. And I do want to say thank you for that clarification that some monies follow students, some does not. And
Thank you, Mr. Doran.
And that's helpful, I think, to our community. And before I go to my last question at this go around anyway, I do want to say thank you to the staff. I mean, we are dealing with these issues. And I think everyone's intent is really to try, and we're trying to problem solve something together. And I really want to thank administration for handling my questions, and I think that everybody appreciates your handling everyone's questions. And I do want to say I had a great meeting today with Mr. Minard and Ms. McQuan talking about 6-8 types of things. So with that said, my other question, I tend to think, Ms. Moline, this is probably on your list, but is the busing question, just so we, it's come up in a lot of different things. I know we are hopeful that busing will be different than this year. We would love to be at the 120 plus routes, fully staffed, fully bused. But given that the fact that we're generously 50 or 60%, I guess, of fulfilling that this year, and parents have had some real issues. And part of I bring it up because I remember when we closed Barnett as a school, as a neighborhood school, and it was repurposed, reopened as a magnet school. Joy in particular received a number of parents from near the Hunter neighborhood who had been attending Barnett, and then they were shifted. And one of their big questions to me, I was getting calls from them saying, can we come to Denali? Because we can walk there if we have to pick our kid up. We can't walk to Joy and walk back home if our kid is sick. So it's a matter of distance. Parents have done a tremendous job. Staff has done a tremendous job this year in dealing with the challenges we have. It's no one's to blame. It's what our labor situation is. But that has come up for a number of questions. Where are we, where are we on busing? Best, aside from best hope, but practicality of reassurance of some sort.
So are you asking for a transportation update, or how is transportation affected by school efficiency scenarios?
Well, if we close a couple of schools, we're going to have to bus some students. I honestly don't know how the ILSIN works on their busing on base.
No impact on ILSIN whatsoever.
Right. But if we close Joy, those students, some of them are already traveling by bus. Mm-hmm. So it's just saying where that bus goes. It might be a shorter ride. It may be.
So needless to say, there's infinity number of scenarios that we could run from a transportation perspective, not knowing at this point what's actually going to occur. They have run a few common possible scenarios, several, and the transportation department sees no additional need or less need for routes based on a number of different possible scenarios. I will say in administration's very preliminary attempts to look at how a reboundary map would look, we are looking at potentially eliminating some of the gerrymandering nature that is seen in the existing map, eliminating, kind of simplifying the map, so to speak, where in the absence of transportation, there are certain schools that would have their attendance areas more focused around the building. So it would lessen the burden on parents. And again, just acknowledging the challenges and appreciating the efforts that the community is making in the absence of those transportation services. So that is at the forefront of our mind as we're going about these preliminary activities, and that's our hope, is to lessen that potential burden going forward.
And I would just add to that, or emphasize to that, in some of the scenarios that we ran in possible configurations of boundaries, there's a possibility that some students would still have buses, but spend less time on the bus than they currently do because of the current way that the boundaries are drawn. So again, looking at all different kinds of things, but in some scenarios, students would actually have less bus time and be closer to their attendance area school. So that was somewhat encouraging in the transportation as we were looking at possible transportation situations. And I will say this year in transportation has been a challenge like no other. I think every year is a bit of a challenge, but this like no other. But I also have seen that we're adding routes, to full delivery routes. Even now, we're looking at adding more and more. So instead of going the other way of losing transportation options, we're gaining transportation options even into this school year. So while it's not pretty, it's quite ugly, it is improving. So that is encouraging for where we are in the current climate. To be able to add routes, I think, is a real testament to how our community is pulling together, training drivers, Durham's working as a partner. So that's an aside.
Thank you.
All right, Mrs. Moline, go ahead and continue on with your questions.
Okay, we have just one more question that I want to cover tonight. And then there's been questions and answers emailed to board members at other times throughout the process. But the last one that I have for tonight is if a building is repurposed to include things like the gym, maybe a science lab or BEST, who will be held liable if someone gets hurt, since BEST instructors are parents? So for this particular situation, BEST students are Fairbanks North Star Borough School District students. So they would be considered just like any student that would be in our building, even though they may receive their instruction in a non-traditional way. They're still our students and would be covered under any insurance liability. And just like anyone that uses our building, there is liability that covers the usage. And that is the end of our question list that we've received from different individuals. And then on top of the ones that we've already sent out to the board for your information.
Thank you, Ms. Moline. I see Ms. Marati has her hand up.
Thanks. So back to the liability question. So what is the plan for BEST then in the repurposed building when it comes to the students using the building? Are we going to have staff in the building in order to make that happen? Are parents going to have keys? I don't think I quite understand how that's going to work out.
Yeah, the building would be staffed. Oh, sorry, Ms. Moline.
Nope, I was just going to start, but you can go ahead and go.
Yes, the building would be staffed by our current BEST staff. And then if we had other repurposed programs, they would also be sharing that facility and oversight of the facility.
Yeah, so just to elaborate a little bit on that, we have BEST staff now that, serve the students and serve the families. And so we wouldn't be necessarily adding staff to put into that building. It would be a matter of giving the staff that we have the space to do their job with a little more effectively, having their own space instead of being kind of crammed into a small office building or office space in a building.
Ms. Marati?
All right, that was it. I lowered my hand.
All right, thank you. Mr. Doran?
Related to that, and again, if you want to wait until the budget comes out, but my question is, if BEST was relocated, I'm not saying where to, whether it's into a repurposed building or into part of another building, because they need some more space, it would be advantageous. That would free up some space here in central office. And again, if you're not ready, I guess I can wait 2 weeks. But my question will be, what then will that space be used for? Will administration grow into it? Can we lease it to some other program and entity in town? Talking about revenue. If the central office grows into it, is it with added staff or just spreading people out? I mean, I've been in situations where I had staff literally in a closet. And so, when I had some space to get them out of the closet was, but I think that's a question I have anyway, in terms of if we relocate a program, how will that, if it frees up some space, how will that be used? So now or later?
The short answer to your question, without divulging details too early, is the last part of your question there, Mr. Dorn. We do have staff in closet-like spaces in this building at this point, so it would afford certain staff members in this building adequate spaces to do their work.
Okay, and just a heads up, as we look into budget, I'll be looking also as we cut schools, where cuts come up all across the board, But I will also say that every time it's come up about saying cut administration, I used to say as a principal, if I pick up the phone and there's not someone to answer it, that's a direct impact on the school and the classroom. Because as a principal, I don't pick up the phone unless I need the answer. So there's a balance. I want to keep that out there for us and for the public. So.
Thank you. Ms. Moline, was there anything that you would like to end our work session with this evening?
Though I don't have any more questions, but I will say that that this discussion is important because it's a directional, visionary, large directional change that shows a board that has vision, not just at cutting schools, but seeing the bigger picture, what all that means. And there's been quite a bit of discussion around all kinds of different options. But I think it's also important that we realize that this is a big directional shift on how we as a school district see the future of our district and how we see the future of supporting our students and our families in the district. So this is a very complex and nuanced decision. And at some point as a board and an administration, we get the opportunity at this point in history to set that direction and that vision. And it's a heavy lift for everyone. But it's also, I believe, a tremendous honor in the history of our school district to be a part of a group that's willing to tackle difficult decisions, to have a vision for the future and take some really bold steps to see that we support students, we support staff, we support families, and we support our community with how we do education. And we've talked about 6-8 as a way to support our community, as a way to give options for our middle schoolers, as basically a different way of how we look at those middle grades. That's a huge directional shift. So bold and visionary. It's a point in history that we as a school district get to decide how we want to move forward in the 21st century with how we see education. What's our vision for our choices? We have a number of different choices. We have charter schools, we have magnet schools, we have a homeschool. So setting again a direction and vision for how we're going to provide those options for our families. So this is big and this is difficult, and at some point we get to be the ones that at this point in history get to set mission, vision, and direction for moving forward on into the 21st century for this school district. So I just want to acknowledge the hugeness. I don't think that's a real word, but I just made it up, that the hugeness of this task. And I personally want to just thank those people on the team that I serve with, the many hours, the many ways of thinking this through, turning the page and looking at it from a different direction, all of the what if scenarios that we've run, trying to be a part of that vision for a future. And then I want to say thank you to the board. This is a big bite. This is an emotional bite. This is a fiscal bite. This is just a lot to handle. So I just wanted to thank the board for being willing to tackle this and be the people at this point in history that are going to set that vision and direction. So that's all I have for this evening.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Moline. Ms. Marotti, did you have another question?
Yeah, this is for the chair. Can we please have this decision broken up into three pieces because they are three significantly different items, and to group them would be a dishonor to the other pieces that are bundled together with them. I think it would be more clear to have them broken up into three pieces. Is that an option?
I did speak with administration on this issue about separating it into a couple of different options. And if the school closures, the three schools, Anderson, Nordale, and Joy, if that does not pass, then going to the 6-8 model doesn't work, because then we would have to consider a different option, such as the middle school closure. And if the, so kind of it's either the three schools with the 6-8 model included, or it would have to be a different option for the entirety of the vote to work. Ms. Moline, would you like to elaborate that a little bit more?
Sure. So, so as we look at this as in chunks, if we were to chunk out the 6-8 and say we're going to not do that, but we want to do this, because of the interrelatedness of the school closures. So, for instance, if we said, well, we don't want to do 6-8, so that means that we would then look at closing Randy Smith. Would that be tied to that option? And so then if that's the direction that we're going to go, then we need to talk a whole different kind of a school closure. We have a different community to consider. So it's a little bit like starting over with that. So because the options are related, it would be very difficult to say this, but not that. So it would be kind of starting the conversation over again.
So can we separate out then the repurposing from the three school closures? Ms. Luke.
I recall Mrs. Moline and Mr. DeGraw discussing that if we decided to close the schools and not repurpose, I apologize, I looked at Mr. Doran and said Denali, Nordale, that a different school would be in consideration.
Right, and I have said that we would want to relook at that. Again, relook at it with all of the factors that we considered for closure. So if we go primarily, if it was the board's priority to go primarily with age, then we wouldn't close Nordale. If the primary consideration was geography, again, we have the 6 schools on the east side, the 3 or 4 on the west side. So would we go to another east side school that's older? So we would have to go back and evaluate the board's priority for closing. And if age wasn't the main priority, then it might be Nordale. It would just require us going back again and looking at board priorities, and then again, reaching out to a different school community.
Ms. Marotti?
So I'm confused as to why another option other than closing 2 schools, repurposing 1, and the 6-8 configuration, why that's the only way we can make this vote without delaying the process even further out. That doesn't make any sense to me.
So if we close 3, well, I suppose we could close 3 elementary schools and Randy Smith, but if we stay 7-8, then all of the 7th and 8th graders would go to Ryan and Tanana, and then that would leave Randy Smith to be closed or repurposed. So that's the hinging point there for, is it 3 elementaries? Is it 3 elementaries and a middle school? Is it 2 elementaries and a middle school? They're tied to the decision as to which schools are closed. I'm sorry if I'm not adding clarity. Maybe someone else on the team could jump in and add some clarity.
And just in addition to all those factors that Ms. Moline said, one other potential option would be to close 3 elementaries, including an elementary other than Nordale, and still maintain the 6-8 grade configuration move. That would be another option as well. So just to repeat, maintain 6-8 grade configuration, still close 3 elementaries, but replace the Nordale closure with a separate elementary. And again, to Ms. Moline's point, depending on, it would be several factors that would drive the recommendation from administration there.
And then we'd need, again, to reach out to that school community. If it wasn't Nordale, then it was another school, then we would need to reach out to that school community and have the conversation with them.
So if the board does not agree with what the admin has suggested, then the only other option is then to vote no and then go back to the drawing board because another option was not planned out or considered by the administration?
I don't know that it would be going back to the drawing board from square one, but we would have to start looking at a different school. It would be looking at redoing some of the things that we've already done. But if that's the direction, the administration can do whatever the board, the board sets the vision and the direction, and we'll work with the community to do whatever we need to. But at this point in the game, if we don't close the 3 schools that we've identified, and we identify a different school, then we will be, having to have the hard conversations with that school community as well. So if it's not Nordale, it's going to be another school that's going through some of the processes that Joy, Nordale, and Anderson have been working through for the last several weeks, months.
Mrs. Luke, do you see the conundrum in our situation here? Or do any other board members see the issue here?
So I think the one way that we would be able to separate it out is if we say that we close 3 elementary schools. And if Nordale is not the one that we are recommending, we give them the opportunity to work with that 3rd one that is closed.
So here's another thing that we need to consider is that if we run through all the scenarios and the board sets their priority for which schools we close, nothing's saying it wouldn't be Nordale once we ran through all the scenarios and options and considered the board's priority. So I just want to put that out there too, that if we're not going to close Nordale, but we go to another school, it could be possible that we come back around and say, well, there's really no better choice. So that's out there too.
We have a few hands up here. We have Mr. Sampson, Mr. Doran, and then Ms. Smith.
Thanks. With all due respect, I'd like to make it clear that the board is in charge of deciding what schools will be closed in this community, not the administration. Okay? It's in conjunction. We take into consideration your recommendations, keyword recommendations. And to be told that, to be put in a box concerning this matter is concerning to me. Granted, the community is owed the decency and the respect to know that their school may be up for closure. That does not dictate that in our future meeting that we can take Nordale, we can separate these issues from the three schools individually. And to insinuate that we have to vote on this as a package is offensive, okay? If we want to close school A and B and say, nope, we're going to keep C, Nordale, we're going through a 6 to 8. We heard you, the administration, say, in order to go to a 6 through 8, you recommend closing 3 schools. Then we'll say, yeah, sorry we jerked the community around there for a little bit, but we identified A and B, and it's going to be a little while before we identify C. But C is coming, possibly. You know, that's my point. At our meeting, it's the board rules. The administration doesn't have to go back and do a study. I've got a study. We paid for a study, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it's right here in our packet. And it was based on the information that the old boy based it on. So I don't necessarily need the administration to go back and spend more money, okay? I've got lots of information here, and I've had months and months to send my questions in reference to any and all schools that are in this district. My opinion is, I don't know if you can count to 4 or not, but my opinion is that moving forward at our next meeting, when we address this situation, we go with Mr. Dorn's recommendation and Ms. Marati's recommendation, and that is to separate the schools out. Otherwise, I can count to 4. This looks like a waste of time. And you know who's going to suffer over it? The children. So let's get it together, get it on the agenda, deal with it.
Mr. Dorn?
Thank you. A couple of observations. One is that with or without the 6 to 8 configuration, which I really think is separate, we don't need that to make closing of the schools work numbers-wise, because we're only talking about potentially, if we closed 3 schools needing about 600 seats, we have more than that. We have almost 3 times that available within the Fairbanks attendance area. So even with the 600, with the 7-8 staying configuration. So I think we can really separate it. The other thing is that I think it is really important that each of the 3 parts of this package, so to speak, and I think it's good that we have presented it together, because they are really complementary, but they are separate issues and impact different parts of our community in different ways. And to take the time to spotlight that, really offer our community what the plan, what the pros and cons are, I think is really important. Because the fix to this whole thing is we need the whole community. And I think when you talk about a closing of school, that's one thing, and it's very emotional. You talk about moving 1 grade level, that's a other whole different thing. And I think there's, I've gone through, there's some real good pluses for that. It's not really a trade-off between whether 6th grade is better at elementary or better in a middle school. There are pluses and minuses to both of those things, but they're separate things. Whether we really relocate a program is a separate deal. So I think it's really important that we do that. I think the other question that we really have is out there, whether we do 2 or 3 schools, whether those are all elementary or, we've had the middle school conversation that's spanned at least the last 7 or 8 years about closing one of the middle schools, or repurposing a middle school. Give each its due. I think we have I think there's a pretty good consensus, and even as I talk with people around the community, and I won't pretend that's a majority view, because but different people, they can understand getting why 2 schools, and particularly Joy and Anderson. Not that the people are jumping, oh yeah, you're going to close the school, that's great, that's what you need. But they can understand that. We have some good rationale there. The third one is really much more questionable. I can tell you, I'm not supportive of doing 3 schools. I think we need to make a step forward. I think that by separating school closures, 6-8, which would impact what you would do, what schools you, but take the time to look at them. And if it takes us 2 years to get there, it takes us 2 years. We've talked about closing schools for probably the last 4 or 5 years, maybe longer than that. It's come up over the decades. So it's not new. This is the first time that as a community, we're saying we have to close a school, and not only 1, but 2. 3, I really see there are options within our community to try and address it, and I don't minimize the burden that puts on administration to bring us a budget in 2 weeks with their best efforts. But I would really separate them out, the reasons I've said, and then I would really be looking at, I can tell you where I'm standing is 2 schools, but we have to keep in mind that doesn't get us out of 3 schools doesn't get us out of the problem, financial problem. We have to figure this out long term. But again, we have finances, we have staff shortages, we have a lot of available seats. Keeping those in mind, I think we have a 2-year project, but this would be a minimum of 2-year project. But this is really major steps forward if we go with 2. But whether it's 2 or 3, school closures are separate. And if we do have to take more time to say what that 3rd school is, then let's take the time to do it and figure out what's best for our students and our community.
Thank you. To answer Mr. Sampson or the board's question, and also to let the community know, is that what is on the agenda is a recommendation, but during the meeting on Tuesday, that recommendation can also be appealed to have different options put up for a vote. And so any combination of that could be changed, such as Mr. Doran stated 2 schools, or stating 2 schools and saying a 3rd one will be looked at, or putting out for multiple or different votes or individual votes. That is something that can be brought up during the meeting and changed, because my understanding is that it's already been posted. And so it can't be changed at this time, but that we can definitely bring that up in the meeting and create motions to give any possible scenario that we have previously discussed. So Ms. Marati, that's definitely something that we can do during the meeting on Tuesday. And that's how we can ensure that we are fulfilling our jobs on the board. I'm going to go to Ms. Smith and then Mr. Doran.
Thank you. I have to admit, I was not a proponent of breaking up the vote. Maybe I've been swayed a little through our conversation. But but I just want to put it out there to the board members and to the public that, to me, the real question seems to be, does the board support repurposing a building or not repurposing a building? Because once that question is answered, the other scenarios make sense or don't make sense. We're just choosing one of those two. Does the board want a 6-8 model or doesn't it want a 6-8 model? I mean, I see what Mr. Dorn is saying, that some of those questions have to be answered before the package can be really addressed. Because if the board as a whole doesn't support repurposing a building, then the recommended motion in our published agenda, if that's what we vote on and it fails simply because of the repurpose, we have, I understand what you're saying, that we can make a motion to remove the repurpose, but, I think it's going to be a complicated process that might come out to something that doesn't even work in the end, or isn't manageable in the end, or, where we're each just trying to get something. So my question or hope for the board would be to all consider over this weekend and all the information we've been given, do we even want to repurpose a building? Because if we do, then there's certain buildings that we would choose. And if we don't, do we even support a 6-8 model? Because if we don't, why are we even considering this this recommended motion? So I know what I support. I do support repurposing a building. I don't particularly care what building it is. I support closing 3 schools because we have serious issues. But I support our administration telling us what schools those are going to be, and what best suits our goals. Because as a board, we set the goals, but we don't need to micromanage what exactly how those goals are sort of played out. That's what I see as the role of the board, is to say we want to close 3 schools, or we want to close 2 schools if that's what we want to do, and we want to repurpose one of the buildings, and then give the administration the leeway to make those decisions. We either trust them to make those decisions or we don't. So I'm not sure what I'm saying here, except for that I do support repurposing a building. I don't care what building it is. I support closing 3 schools. It's up to the administration what 3 schools those are. And I do support the 6 to 8 middle school configuration for many reasons. The main one being that better services will be offered to our middle school students. North Pole has had 6 to 8 forever. And the kids have great services there in the 6 to 8 model. So that's just where I'm at. So the board might want to be thinking up their motions over the weekend, and we need to get this worked out, but we need to trust our administration to make the right decision after we set the goal of which schools it can be. And I never understood how we're supposed to pick from 35 schools with all the information. No matter how much information they provide to us, we don't have that intricate knowledge, and they can't give it to us. When they come to us and tell us what's best, if we say 2 schools, they'll tell us the 2. If we say 3, they'll tell us the 3. If we say repurpose, they'll tell us the right ones. So maybe I do support spreading it out. Thank you for the time.
And before I turn it over to Mr. Doran, I do want to say I helped write the agenda, and I did take the recommendation from administration, and I approved the motion that was put out, because as you look at it, it does simplify it. And as a board, as the entirety of the board, we then have the right at the board meeting to be able to change that motion and move it to how the board as a whole sees fit. And so it was not some mismanagement from administration. but it was me approving the recommendation from the district and from administration and moving that forward. But like I said, we at the next meeting as a board can decide to change how it will be voted upon. Mr. Doran and then Mr. DeGraw had something.
And I want to reinforce what you mentioned. It's not any misstep by either you or administration, as you and the chief school administrator put the agenda together. I mean, that's fine. In lots of ways, this is the first real discussion we've had. We've gotten answers to multiple questions and a lot of information, but in terms of how we want to move forward. So time-wise, very appropriate emotion as going forward. Just a thought, I think we can anticipate there will be either a substitute motion or amendments to it. As we think through that as a board, maybe that we give some thought to, I'm just afraid of, if we come with 7 different ones, which might be, because we have different perspectives and stuff. But just as we go through, we give some thought to that if we're combining ideas, and so that we're not hitting you, with and the public with, oh, boom, boom, boom. That's where we actually may have a lot of similarity, and I don't know how we get there quite. Also being mindful of Open Meetings Act, but I think as we move into that, we may want to try and give some sort of consideration of how that would look at. I mean, I, for one, would definitely submit something to separate them out right off the bat. But but others have other ideas, and I'm just trying to think that process. But thank you for putting it on. I think where our discussion is, and as we continue to move forward and have the conversations, thanking the public for their involvement, particularly over these last couple of weeks, is really important because that helps formulate where we go. But I want to thank you and Ms. Moline for, the topics there, front and center for us. We can go from there.
Thank you, Mr. Doran. Mr. DeGraw?
Yeah, thanks. Just final comment. I would submit that administration's job is to submit a recommendation to the board for either approval, rejection, or amend. To your point, Ms. Luke, to amend that. It's our job to do that legwork, to vet out the multiple options that are in front of us, and not necessarily just to present to the board, here's 4 or 5 different choices that you could do. You rely on us to provide a recommendation to the Board of Education. And then just also to submit that the board did move for the creation of a task force that provided specific recommendations. That task force was created from a significant cross-section of our community, from multiple stakeholder groups, and then nearly 3,000 survey responses to several questions. So thank you.
Thank you. Being respectful of time, it looks as though everyone has been able to speak. I would like to ask for a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Second.